Hi everyone. Historians may look back in time and see this is the point where I finally flipped, but I've decided to make a bit of a video rant about what I'm going to call cargo cult tuning. First of all, what is a cargo cult? Well, I'm not a historian, so if you want to look this up, there are plenty of sources about it, but my understanding is that during World War II, in the Pacific theatre, so between America and Japan, both the Japanese and the Americans used Melanesian islands as air bases so that they could attack each other with short-range aircraft. Now, to gain the cooperation of the locals, what they did was they brought all sorts of supplies and commodities from their developed homelands that they didn't have in these relatively primitive islands. But then when the war was over and the Japanese and Americans abandoned their air bases, they stopped bringing all these commodities from these first world countries, and the islanders were sort of left back to the way they were, and they wanted these commodities again. Now, the locals didn't really understand the logistics involved in delivering cargo supplies to an island several thousand kilometres away. All they saw was the local army people talking on radios, and then the planes landed and the goods came out. So they probably thought that that's all that was involved. So they started making their own radios and control towers and airstrips and that sort of thing out of stuff that they had locally, like coconuts and bamboo and things like that, and talk on them and expecting the planes to land. And of course they didn't, but they thought that just by going through what they'd seen the other people do without really understanding any of it, then they'll get the same result. Now, Richard Feynman, the famous physicist who's part of the Manhattan Project and various other things, termed what he called cargo cult science, which is where people dress up like scientists and they do sciencey things and they do experiments and they act the way they see scientists acting, and they believe that they're doing science. But they don't do all the things that science is really about, like publishing results for peer review before you talk to the popular press about them, because you might be wrong. Chances are you are wrong if you've made a brilliant discovery. Another thing science expects of scientists is to publish their results in peer-reviewed journals, encourage others to try and replicate the results to make sure that they're actually right. They're not a mistake in their experimental design or something like that. So some fairly well-known examples would be, if you're alive in the 80s, you would remember the cold fusion thing, where a couple of chemists, not physicists, claimed to have created nuclear fusion happening at room temperature in a test tube, not producing lethal amounts of neutrons and that sort of thing that would kill them. And more modern examples would include things like fad diets, fake cancer cures and other things like that, which is being pushed onto vulnerable people by people who don't know better to people who don't know better. Now, I want to talk about cargo cult tuning because unfortunately I'm seeing a fair bit of it now. What I'm seeing is people not really understanding what's going on or understanding the theory, but going through the motions, and someone that doesn't understand tuning would look at them and think that they know what they're doing. For example, they know that engines generally need more ignition time as RPM increases, and they need less ignition time as load increases. So if there's a large flat area in a timing map or a big step in a timing map, then that's probably not what the engine actually wants. But unfortunately it leads to memes like this being posted on Facebook. And there are so many things wrong with this, I'm not exactly sure where to begin. The first thing I like to say is that it's a big attitude problem. It's very self-righteous. It's like there are two types of tuners, and I'm one of the good ones because I can see what's wrong with this cheap map, and aren't I special? Well, I think that having an 11-degree timing difference between 1600 and 2000 RPM is probably going to make the car a little bit difficult to drive. So it might not be the best map in the world, but I don't know. I haven't driven the car. I don't know what the car actually wants. But that's not the point. The point is that someone's looked at this map and seen that it's smooth-ish, and this other map and seen that it's not, and therefore seen that the first one is a good map. But it doesn't take any effort at all to pick 6 data points and then interpolate between them and make a smooth-looking map. It doesn't mean that it's right just because it looks smooth. It's the same thing as talking to a coconut radio and expecting it to talk back to you. I've also seen a lot of misinformation posted. So for example, a lot of times I've seen people say that 12.5 to 1 is the optimum air-fuel ratio for producing torque, and that's why engines are tuned to that when they're on boost. Well, it may be true that 12.5 to 1 produces maximum torque, but that's not the reason why engines are tuned to run richer than stoic on boost. I've also seen a lot of copying without understanding. This is more from end users in the car community rather than professional tuners. But they'll say things like, well, my mate's running the same configuration, and therefore, I'll just put this map in and then drive it, even on boost, without monitoring things. And, well, again, where to start? Well, first of all, your mate isn't running the same configuration. I know you say it's the same configuration, but it's going to be different. every time someone said, my mate's got the same configuration, there have always been differences. And secondly, even if your mate does have the exact same configuration, who's to say that his map's right? For example, unless you've logged fuel pressure on your mate's car, you don't know that his fuel system's actually up to the job. Maybe the fuel system's inadequate and his tuner didn't realise and is just compensating for that in the fuel map, and there's a big hill at the end of the map to compensate for the lack of fuel system. Or maybe the tuner didn't even notice this and the fuel map's fairly flat and it just runs lean in the top. Until you have the data, you don't know, is what I'm saying. It's just a feel opinion. Now secondly, even if your mate's car does maintain good air-fuel ratio and does maintain good fuel pressure, that doesn't tell you how much margin it has. It could be right on the limit of how much fuel the pump can deliver, and there could be hardly anything coming out of that return hose from the reg. And if you copy the same components, do it again, it may not have enough margin this time. Now we can calculate the fuel requirements of an engine. You can see my talk on fuel modelling. I think I'll call it from map to milliseconds from PRI if you want to learn more about how to do that. But for now you can work out what injector size you need and therefore how much fuel pump supply you need as well. Fuel pumps are documented with how much flow rate they can provide at different voltages and different pressures, so you can work out if the system's sufficient or not with only high school level mathematics. You can use this to ensure that you have, say, 20% extra fuel delivery than the engine's going to need if you want to. But I mean, the real engineer would then measure it to make sure that the fuel flow is as specified, because otherwise maybe there's some voltage drop to the pump or whatever that you haven't measured or you haven't accounted for. Another factor that sort of makes me say to always go back to basics if you're getting confused or if things aren't behaving the way that you expect them to behave is that sometimes what appears to be a minor difference can actually make a pretty big difference to the engine. So as you probably know, the modular ECU has got a very sophisticated fuel model, and so if you've tuned an engine for one set of injectors, you can put in another set of injectors, select the different injector setting, and the fuel map's actually going to be very close. And I've done this before, and it did. However, on the particular car I'm thinking of, the transient conditions were completely different. It needed so much more enrichment on the transient throttle conditions, and I was trying to work out why. I eventually worked out the reason. It was because the spray pattern's different. So when more fuel ends up on the runner wall, you need more enrichment to actually deal with that, or high X value in our model. But again, if you don't understand the process for getting the transient conditions right, or the physics behind why you actually need transient corrections in the first place, then you could put the other injector data in, tune the steady state stuff, and the transient conditions would just be wrong, and you'd say, well, it must be the injectors. It's just what they do. It's actually not. And this is one of the reasons that I'm so focused on getting this information out there to help people, so that people can enjoy their cars better, because that's why I got into doing adaptronic in the first place. Now, the final thing I'm going to complain about with cargo cult tuning is where people attempt to fix a problem without actually understanding what the cause of the problem is in the first place. So I've got a phrase which I stole from John Maxwell, which was never tear down the fence until you know why it was put there initially. And I'll give an example, which is a stall on return to idle. Now, there are several things that could cause this, like the fuel map not being correct on the way back down to idle and things like that. So, of course, you need to come up with basic scientific method, right? Year 7 high school stuff. Come up with a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and then you can draw a conclusion as to whether it was right or not. But let's say that the problem is actually that the ECU is going to closed loop idle too early. So as the engine comes back down from high RPM, the ECU is going to closed loop idle too early, and it's saying the RPM's too high, I need to drop down the idle effort duty cycle. So it's doing that before the engine's actually got back down to idle. So by the time it gets back down to idle, it's actually pulled out so much duty cycle that the engine actually stalls. I was talking to a tuner once about this, and I said that may be the reason why you're having a stall and return to idle. I don't know. We'd need to test it. And the solution to that, of course, is to increase the maximum amount of time that the ECU will wait till it goes into closed loop idle automatically. But the tuner suggested, well, why don't we just increase the minimum idle duty cycle percentage so that when the ECU tries to bring it back down, it can't, because it's up against the limit. And I said, well, no, because for a start, that's not actually addressing the problem, if the theory is correct. The problem is that we're going into closed loop idle too early, not that it's dropping the idle effort too far. Because if you attempt to fix it by doing it that way, then there's going to be some condition where the ECU is going to need, or where the engine's going to need, a higher idle duty cycle. For example, if the air conditioner's on, what you'll discover is that if you try to fix it that way, and the actual underlying problem's still there, then you'll fix the problem with the air conditioner off. Then when the air conditioner is turned on, then you'll still have the problem. And you've actually confused things by making it harder to see the problem in the first case by actually changing something that didn't need to be changed in the first place. I've also seen this before with poor diagnosis of problems. So one tuner said that he was having a misfire under load, and he upgraded the ignition system to CDI to fix the misfire, and the misfire was still there. So now he spent all this money upgrading the car to CDI, and he still has a problem. And I asked him to send me a log, and I could see in the log that his map signal was jumping up and down a lot because of the lack of filtering that he'd chosen and the place where he's picking up the map signal from, which was a single inlet runner. Now, for a start, this problem was occurring at only 8 psi of boost, which is well within the capacity of the factory ignition system, so there should be no reason to go to CDI. But secondly, what he did was he started applying a very expensive solution without actually diagnosing the problem correctly in the first place. And this tuner isn't new to this either. I'm sure he knew that 8 psi of boost would be fine with the factory ignition system. So what I'm saying is that you need to be able to diagnose things correctly, and often that's difficult, but you can at least look at the basics. So if you've got a misfire, you can look if your mixtures are consistent, if your milliseconds are consistent, and if your manifold pressure is consistent, that sort of thing. So if you're watching this video or reading this article, then I know that you want to learn, you want to improve. So I guess here are some general points that I can make. The first one is understand the problem. I know that that's easy to say, but I guess what I'm saying is you have to try to understand the problem. You have to want to understand the problem, because if you try to change things and then say, oh, that fixed it, then you don't actually know if you've solved the problem or not, because you don't actually know what the problem was. Secondly, I'd say don't fall into the trap of thinking that there are good tuners and bad tuners, and I'm a good tuner. I mean, obviously it's elitist snobbery, and what makes you think that you're automatically entitled to be in the good group. But the more important thing is that we're all continually learning, and if you stop continually learning, then you've reached the maximum of what you can achieve, and that's it. That's all you can do forever. So I'd much rather be continually learning, and all the tuners I see that gradually improve their skills over the years and get to do high-powered cars and get to filter out, so they have better customers and things like that, they're all the ones that are continually learning. The ones that know what they're doing, just ask them, are the ones that struggle with the same problems year after year. Another thing I'd say is be open to others' experiences. Even if it sounds wrong and it may not be true, it's true for them. They're probably not telling you because they don't believe it themselves. So at the very least, remember it as an anecdote. So if someone else has a similar thing, you can ask them about it to either verify it or contradict it, and you can try it yourself if you get a chance. And sometimes people have said to me things that didn't sound right, and I've experimented with them and it's turned out that I was right, and that's okay. But I don't think it's a good idea to automatically dismiss something just because it contradicts your experience, because that's the same as thinking that you know it all already. And the last thing I'll say is that if you're angry that I'm telling you how to do your job, I'm really not. I'm simply saying what I've observed from tuners over a number of years of dealing with tuners from all over the world with all different levels of experiences and all different attitudes. And I've seen who struggles with the basics and who continually gets better year after year. And in fact, all this really comes down to is wanting to learn and wanting to improve, and believing that you can learn, you can improve, rather than someone's automatically the good tuner or a bad tuner. That's how they're born and that's how they're fixed for life. I think that's a really important thing in life in general. Thank you. Sorry about the rant.